Everyone
So
know when you can see it.
I can definitely see it, but I'm not the important person. The recording has started.
Awesome, great. So, Steve, Sam, thanks for having me here today. Everyone, thanks for joining and listening in. So, I'm Patrick David. I'm a senior customer engineer in the U.S. education space. I've been working with Microsoft for the past 5.5 years, primarily focused on SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive. In the past 9 months, I've been focused on more of the security and compliance side of Microsoft 365. So as part of my role, I get to work with customers to help migrate, design, support, and evangelize the solutions they've bought um, to meet their operational goals. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today. So I just want to share some of the learnings and best practices and common questions that we get from customers with you. I want to make this interactive. So if there's questions, please feel free to stop me, post them in chat. There will be time at the end for Q&A. So definitely please let me know if there's questions or areas you want me to cover. So kind of the agenda for today, we're going to talk about how to secure the EDU collaboration environment. And I'm going to do this with questions or common questions that we hear from customers and to make you aware of the different options that you have available to you and what you might want to consider as you're securing your environment. We're going to look at 2 areas of focus, being Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive today. Obviously, Microsoft 365 has a number of solutions, but in the short amount of time that we have today, we're going to focus on those 2 areas mainly. So just high level sharing inside of Microsoft 365. There's a number of controls that we have available to us. And starting at the top level, we've got the Azure Active Directory B2B settings. And then as we move down, we've got more granular controls with each application inside of Office 365. And so we'll talk about some of the different areas here today. And then as we think about external sharing, there's 2 concepts of external sharing that when I talk to customers, and they're sharing inside the organization, right? So sometimes external sharing is between users inside a team with other departments inside the organization, or maybe other schools inside of that tenant. Or there's external sharing in the regards of maybe I want to share with a parent, or maybe I want to collaborate with another institution. So that's kind of our 2 areas of focus for when we talk about external sharing. Mainly today, we're going to talk about external sharing outside of the tenant or outside of that organization. So first, let's start talking about Microsoft Teams. And so Teams, the questions that we hear from customers and ways that we can kind of address these are, can I have different controls for faculty and staff versus students? Should students or staff be able to connect with people outside via chat? Can I control guest access with my teams? How do I allow for guest speakers? Or how do I allow for parent-teacher conferences in my organization? And a lot of these controls are managed in the Teams admin center. And so we'll talk about some of these controls here. So one of the first things is policies for students and staff. So you can have different policies. We've done a number of things in this space to help you manage or create these policies. We recently introduced the Teams for Education Policy Wizard. So if you log into the Teams Admin Center, you'll now see a policy wizard show up if you haven't seen that already, which will help you go through and create policies for students and staff, give you kind of a walkthrough on how to do that. And then we've also got a guide available, which we released a little while back. And it talks about best practices for managing Teams policies for keeping students safe inside of Teams. So if you're not aware, there's resources. And again, these slides will be made available to you afterwards. So we can share and you'll be able to click on those resources. So external access is one of the big questions we get when we're talking to EDU customers. And this has to do with the one-on-one chats or the one-to-many chats that you have in Teams. And so some of the common questions that we hear here are, should students be able to have conversations with others? Should your faculty and staff be able to have one-on-one chats outside your organization? Can you have different policies for each of those, right? So students can chat, faculty and staff, or students can't chat, faculty and staff can chat externally. And so you can have controls here over those capabilities. And you can either turn it on or off. You can limit this by domain. So these are considerations that you might want to do as you're rolling out Teams in your environment. Another big area that we hear with education customers is the allowing guest. And so guest in this context is when we're having conversations that are happening inside of a Teams channel, sharing files or sharing conversations inside of that particular Teams channel. So this isn't the one-to-one or one-to-many type chat. These are actual conversations that are happening inside of a team channel. And so do we want to allow guests in this aspect? What are they allowed to do, right? So can they have chats? Can they use memes? Can they edit their messages? And so these are controls that you want to consider. The other thing with this is that you can control who can actually add guests to Teams. And so while that control is not done in the Teams environment or in the Teams admin center, we do have controls either at the Azure AD level in that B2B sharing that we talked about, or in the group settings. So you can say, hey, only these folks are able to add new members to our organization, or maybe we're only allowing members with this domain or this organization to be added inside of Teams. Anonymous users is another area that we have several deep discussions with EDU customers. And to be honest, I see the pros and cons with each side of the argument here. Ideally in education, especially K to 12, we'd like to see this disabled so that only people joining meetings are authenticated and we know who they are. And this helps you further down the road. I've had lots of conversations with customers in this space, and just provides the most secure setup for your organization. I understand there's many reasons why you maybe need to enable this, but we should try and avoid it if possible. If you can avoid it, some things that we've worked with organizations to do has been like classroom meetings for students have like no guest allowed, right? So if you're having that session or that class for the day, you make sure that all the students coming into there are actually members of your organization, right? So you're not allowing anonymous guests in there. Maybe you're only allowing anonymous for parent-teacher conferences or open lecture sessions, and then you're taking on maybe a bit more risk, but that's a trade-off that we have. Using waiting rooms, right? So we've added the waiting rooms, verify who's in the room before you actually let someone into the meeting. Another one I worked with an education institution a little while back is we decided to upload icons for all the students in the organization. So as faculty and staff are looking at who's sitting in the waiting room, they could quickly identify just based on the pictures for those students, which ones were actually authenticated users and which ones were guest or anonymous users to admit them into the meeting. And then you might want to consider having meetings in channels instead of having the ad hoc meetings that we have in Teams. So you could actually have meetings in channels, and then users in the channels are able to join that meeting. So these are going to be authenticated users. There's not going to be anonymous users in your Teams channels. And this also provides you additional controls with chat messages. So controlling team sprawl. This is a big area of conversations we have with customers. Why do I have so many teams? How do I control who can create the teams in my organization? Do I want to allow students to create teams? How do I make sure people in the team have the right access? how do I manage team lifecycle, right? Over time, I continuously add new teams. How do I make sure that we're cleaning those up? And so we have a number of controls that can help with this. So we've got group creation capabilities where we can limit who can actually create groups or teams in our organization. And so you can control this by security membership. So only members of a particular security group have the ability to create teams. And others outside of that will need to either go through a request process to create teams. So maybe in a K through 12 organization, what we see is every time a team's created, it needs to have a faculty or staff member associated with it, right? In larger higher ed organizations, maybe we usually see organic, right? Where anyone can kind of create a team, but we have controls over that. And so some of those controls that we have are like naming standards. So you can add prefixes or suffixes. Maybe it's you have multiple departments or students in different colleges, and you want to prefix each team that they create with the code, student code, or the code for that particular college or university. We also want to control blocking maybe certain words or bad words when users are creating teams. So you can actually specify a list of words that you want to restrict or prevent users from creating. And those can also be departments. Maybe you don't want students to be able to create a team called HR or a team called research, for example. And so you can add words to block. We can also control access with labels. And so public versus private is a big conversation we have with organizations, right? When I create a new team, what does it mean when it's private versus public? And this is a big one, right? Public means anyone inside your organization has read, write access to anything inside of that team. So we can control this with labels or sensitivity labels that every time a site gets created, and I think as Steve mentioned this before, maybe it's a student site versus a faculty and staff site, or maybe it's a public site versus a private site, right? And with the label applied, we can actually control not only whether it's public or private, like internally, we can also control things like internal access versus external access. Can you add guests to this particular site? Can we control things like unmanaged devices, right? Accessing files. Maybe we don't want to allow this particular site to have files to be downloaded. So we can control that with sensitivity labels. Guest access reviews. So every 6 months, maybe you want to review or have the owners review who has access to a particular team. And so we can set up guest access reviews where the owners of that team get a review and says, hey, here's all the guests that are currently members of your particular team. Do they still need access? And so there's a way to kind of clean up membership to make sure that we're not oversharing or folks that shouldn't have access no longer have the access. And then expiration, right? So especially in that organic environment, we get teams that are created every day, right? And some get used, some don't, some over time, the project ends. We want to make sure we're going through and cleaning those up so we can actually create expiration policies that look at teams that are either 6 months, 12 months old, and then can send a note to the owners and ask them, hey, is this site still being used or not? And then we can remove that. So as education customers, there's the ability to use the student data sync. And so if you've already got a LMS system, you can use or tap into that to create class sites inside of Teams very rapidly. And this controls also the membership of that. So the teacher student roles, members versus owners. And it gives the faculty a ability to get in and set up that site before we actually allow the students in. So it's great in that capacity also. And then it allows that control based on the membership of your LMS system. So if you haven't explored this, a great area to look at going forward. So those are kind of the big areas when we talk to customers about teams that we see. I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about SharePoint and OneDrive and some of the controls we have here. So controlling, sharing in SharePoint. And so the back end for any team that you have is a SharePoint site. So the files that you add are all stored in a SharePoint site, and SharePoint has its own controls available to it when it comes to sharing. And so some of the common questions we hear are, how do I prevent oversharing in SharePoint and OneDrive? I don't want students to be able to share outside of my tenant, or I want to limit my users. I want to limit who my users can share with, right? Maybe that's by domain. Maybe that's by different groups, like students can't share, but faculty and staff can share externally. So we have these controls. And so if you go into the SharePoint Admin Center, there is toggles where you can set the controlling sharing options to anyone, new and existing guest, and only people inside my organization. And so anyone means we can create anonymous links. And so we usually don't see organizations use this, or if they do use it, they limit where this actually is occurring. And so these same controls can be done at a per site basis. So each site collection could have more restrictive controls for that particular site. So let's say we've got a highly sensitive site, we've got a lot of student data in there. We want to make sure that that particular site is only available to people inside an organization, for example. And so you can have those types of controls. We can also limit sharing by domain, right? So we can say, okay, we're going to allow sharing to happen, but only with members of these domains. In addition to that, we can manage who can actually share based on a security group, right? So internally, anyone can share, but externally, maybe only faculty and staff can share files out, right? So think like student OneDrive, great area for them to have their files, but maybe we only want that to happen inside of the organization, where faculty and staff, maybe we can share files with parents or other institutions there. So we can actually control via security group who can share either anonymous links or external links. And so you have those types of capabilities here. And then controlling how people share files. So we can change that default sharing experience. The default sharing experience when you click the share button is anyone inside my organization and edit access. And so sometimes that might lead to oversharing because the default being anyone inside my organization, and maybe folks don't read what type of sharing link they're creating. And so then anyone with that link inside the organization has access to that file. You can change the default settings to say, maybe make the default only the people that the user specifies, and maybe only give them view access. Now, this doesn't prevent them from changing that, but it does change that default behavior that we see customers use. And so this is another area I like to talk to customers about and focus on as we're thinking about external sharing. Now, one that just came up recently with this customer that Steve mentioned was we actually wanted to remove the organizational sharing link. And so there is the capability, and this is done on a per site collection basis. And there's a script here that you can run or reference. But we were able to actually remove the share with the organization link here. So this is just an example of what it would look like. So their only options were with specific people or people with existing access. So we were able actually to remove that. So if you are getting oversharing and you just want to remove that link, that can be done here. So I know that was pretty quick, short amount of time. I want to open it up to any questions. I know we had some questions before, but any questions, feel free to come off mute.
There's one question in there. Is there a way to do exceptions to the expiration policy?
Yes. So you can make exceptions to the expiration policy. So you can choose which sites actually fall into that expiration policy. So you can exclude sites if you don't want them in there. It might be scripting if it's quite large. So.
I guess to clarify, my question was if you have it set to where the expiration policy is applied to the entire tenant for the teams, it doesn't appear that there's a way to do exceptions. I think it seems like the only way to do exceptions is if you just apply it to a specific set of groups or teams, unless I'm mistaken. That's what I was trying to find out.
Yes. Yeah, that is the way it is set up today. So if you're going to do the all tenant, there's not like a all tenant except these users. But that's great feedback, Kevin. So we can definitely take that back.
Yeah, just because we had specific teams that we never wanted to expire. It wasn't necessarily specific users, but specific teams like ones that we had created for some of our phone queues and stuff that we don't want to ever expire. Yeah, that's the use case.
And is there someone there to approve it? I mean, so.
Yeah, there is, but it's always a possibility that it gets missed, and for some of the scenarios, it's a pretty big headache if somehow it gets missed and somebody lets it expire.
Yeah, and the other thing too is if the team is active, we can avoid sending that email, right? So if we see something's happened in the last 3 months or some activities taking place.
And I think that maybe the problem is possibly what activity it's looking at, because like a couple of these teams are only basically just being used because of they were required for the phone queue, for the team's voice for the phone queues. And I think the type of activity it was doing wasn't tripping that activity setting.
Gotcha.
So
yeah, I mean, if it's not, someone's not actively in a chat or uploading files.
So they never chat. They never
yeah.
chat with these users specifically. They're used in that team's voice for the phone queues. So I think that's what the issue is.
Okay. No, again, great feedback. You can take
Thank
that. So you got some more in chat here. So Christopher, one of our conditional access policies wasn't applied recently to a SharePoint sharing guest user. How can that gap be filled?
So from a conditional access perspective, one of the things you can do is you can look at the login of that user and then look and see what conditional access policies were applied to and which ones weren't. And then you can determine why that one was not applied. We've actually enhanced a lot of the reporting features inside the UI in Azure Active Directory around conditional access. That should help you troubleshoot why that person's was not affected by the conditional access policy that you think they should have.
Yeah, that's a great point, Steve. And I was working with a customer just recently, and even internally, they were being blocked. And so using those logs to determine which policy was blocking them in that case. But yeah, that's a great call out there. So next question, we see a way to share individual files with outside users where they cannot download a file. But is there a way to do this, the entire folder of Office files when sharing a folder doesn't appear as an option to prevent downloading of files? Not at the folder level. One thing you can do here is with sensitivity labels, I know we didn't have time to go into that completely, but with sensitivity labels and conditional access, if it's a particular sensitive site, you can specify a policy that on unmanaged devices, that they have like web-only access controls. So that's an option. The other option, not using the share button, but if you use the SharePoint permissions, you can create a custom permission level that doesn't allow the files to be downloaded or taken offline, and then add the particular users to that SharePoint group. So it's not going to be done using the sharing link, but if you do give direct access to that particular folder using the SharePoint permission levels, it's possible that way also.
Awesome. So we've got about 1 minute left. I do want to share a couple of future presentations that are coming up on June 9th and just around the compliance stuff. So we're going to figure out the security stuff, and next week when we have our security session, we will have a couple weeks out so everybody knows what's going on. But on June 9th, we're going to have Mr. Sam Buckhalter back, and he's going to talk about compliance endpoint DLP. And on July 7th, we're going to have somebody from our education product group, Mr. Bill Sluss, come in and talk about the changes that are coming inside of information barriers. Today, information barriers is there. There is, it's all, done through address books and everything like that, and it's a little kludgy. We're making some really big changes to information barriers, most of it with education in mind. So you think about, hey, you've got a large school district, you got a couple high schools, you only want people in certain grades to be able to collaborate with each other. You don't want people to collaborate outside of their schools, those types of things. And I think we're going to be able to support up to like 5,000 different rules when we start out with, and of course we'll scale out as we need to, but stuff like that. We're making those announcements at ISTE, which is on June 15th. Unfortunately, our next session is not until July 7th, so Bill's going to come in and talk about those on the July 7th one. And other than that, thank you again, everybody, for joining. Look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks when we kick back off with the security sessions. And as a matter of fact, after this call, I'm getting on with Mr. Nick there, and we're going to plan those sessions out. So as soon as we have those sessions planned out, I will post those inside the Teams chat as well. And Patrick, thank you again for your presentation. It was very informative, and I will get the deck and we'll get the recording up to our YouTube and into my Azure Blob storage for everybody to download and listen to afterwards. Thank you.